As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" Then, after speaking about false prophets, wars, earthquakes, famine, familial discord, persecution, the desecration of the temple, and the siege of Jerusalem, Jesus then told his disciples, "But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens." When Jesus stood on the Mount of Olives and prophesied about the temple's destruction, did he suddenly change topics 3/4 of the way through his speech and begin speaking about his second coming? Or was he talking exclusively about the destruction of the temple, which took place in AD 70? That is what the debate is about. Whether we see the Olivet Discourse as having Jesus refer to his second coming, or whether we take what is known as a preterist perspective on this passage and see Jesus exclusively concerned with the Judean rebellion against Rome, which resulted in the sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. In this video, I'm going to briefly analyze the Olivet Discourse of Mark 13, Luke 21, and Matthew 24 to 25, which I briefly read out and summarized from Mark's version. And if you watch to the end of this video, hopefully you'll be convinced, or maybe even challenged, on how to understand Jesus' famous words about the temple, judgment, and the coming of the Son of Man. First, we have to understand the Olivet Discourse in the context of Jesus' mission. Jesus was a proponent of what is called Jewish restoration eschatology. Now, that's a fancy way of referring to a cluster of hopes of things which the prophets had promised. Things which include the vanquishing of Israel's enemies, the regathering of the 12 tribes together, judgment on the wicked, the coming of a Messiah, a new David, a new temple, agricultural bounty, and a whole lot more. What is more, Jesus, like many others before him and contemporary to him, made strident critiques of the priestly leaders in charge of the temple. Jesus, like the prophet Jeremiah or the Qumranites who housed the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had negative things to say about the chief priests in their day, about their moral corruption and bringing impurities into the temple. Jesus, like many others, criticized the temple, seeing it as more of a monument to Herod's self-aggrandizement than it was a font of holiness and worship. And like other Jews, Jesus also looked forward to a new temple, one that even the nations would flock to. Let me give you another way to understand the Olivet Discourse.
On the Mount of Olives, Jesus and his disciples gazed at the magnificent Jerusalem temple, a symbol of God's presence and holiness. The disciples, filled with awe, saw its grandeur and greatness, but Jesus saw its imminent destruction. "Do you see all these great buildings?" he asked. "Not one stone here will be left on another." This was not just a prediction, but a declaration of judgment on the temple and its priestly apparatus. The disciples, shocked, asked, "When will this happen? What will be the sign that it is about to take place?" Jesus then proceeded to tell them about the signs and portents that would precede the temple's destruction. This speech was the climax of Jesus' confrontation with the temple and all it represented. Jesus had entered Jerusalem as king, caused a commotion in the temple, and challenged its priestly leaders with his teaching. Now, from the symbolic vantage of the Mount of Olives, he pronounced the temple's judgment and eventual destruction. Jesus was not delivering a distant oracle. He was announcing the consequences of his mission. The fate of the temple and his own fate were intertwined. One would fall, so the other could be vindicated.
Second, we have to consider the language of the Son of Man coming and how that relates to Daniel 7. For many people, cosmic portents of sun, moon, and stars mentioned in the Olivet Discourse sound like the literal end of the world. Plus, the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory and gathering his elect. Surely that has to be the second coming. But what if it's not? I mean, consider this. On the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, Peter explained the coming of the Holy Spirit and the accompanying signs with a quotation from the prophet Joel, chapter 2 of the book of Joel, where it says that the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood. But that did not literally happen on the day of Pentecost. The sun did not turn to darkness and the moon did not turn to blood. Yes, people spoke in tongues and received the Spirit, but the universe did not melt down. And this proves, I think, that significant events can be described in seismic and symbolic language to underscore its astounding significance. The same for the destruction of the temple. The fall of the temple is a socio-political catastrophe for Jews and Judaism, and it's described in the language of a cosmic drama and destruction to highlight its intensity and its overall meaning. But what about the coming of a Son of Man? I mean, surely that's not symbolic. Surely that is about Jesus' actual return. I can understand why you might think that, but maybe not. For a start, in Daniel 7, the one like a Son of Man travels to the Ancient of Days. Now, assuming that the Ancient of Days, Yahweh, is in heaven, then Daniel's Son of Man travels from earth to heaven to receive authority, glory, power, dominion, and worship. It's a text that's about enthronement, the vindication of this human-like figure over and against the pagan beasts who have attacked Israel, and has the Son of Man reigning with the Almighty. That's what Daniel 7 is about. It's not about Jesus coming to earth to bring judgment. The best comparison for that passage about the Son of Man coming in Mark 13:24-27 is if we look at another Markan text, Mark 14:62. If we look closely at Mark 14:62, the coming of the Son of Man designates Jesus' exaltation and enthronement, because that text is a conflation of Psalm 110 and Daniel 7:13, two texts which talk of a person, a representative of Israel, being co-enthroned with the God of Israel. In fact, Matthew and Luke make it even more explicit that this is a type of enthronement or exaltation, because they add the words, "From now on, you," that is Caiaphas and the high priest, "will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power or the mighty God." As if the enthronement is already happening. I mean, the process is already begun and underway. So what we can learn from this, and this is what I think the point of the saying about the coming of the Son of Man in glory and power in Mark 13, I think what that means is when the temple is finally destroyed, when it's desecrated, that vindicates Jesus' critique of the temple and proves that Jesus was the prophet who has been proved right, and he is now enthroned with God as the heavenly Son of Man. Let me give you a nice, dramatic, and picturesque summary of what I've just said.
When Jesus spoke of the coming of the Son of Man, he drew from Daniel's vision of the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days, a coming that is not a descent to earth, but about a human figure ascending to God's throne. The loaded language where the one like a Son of Man receives authority, glory, and sovereign power was a story of vindication, enthronement, and reigning with God. It was not about a literal return to earth. It was about the Son of Man sharing God's throne. The destruction of the temple was indeed a world-shaking event, signaling the end of an old order. Jesus' coming was the sign of his vindication and enthronement, not a physical return. Judgment fell on Jerusalem's unfaithful leadership through Rome. The temple's fall was the sign that Jesus had received his kingdom. The nations would be gathered not by rapture but by the spread of the gospel. Jesus tied these events to his own generation. The disciples asked for a sign. He gave them the desolation of the holy place. That would be the proof that the Son of Man now reigned and a new age had begun. The logic of the discourse is clear. Judgment and vindication were inseparable.
Third, the Olivet Discourse, especially in Mark and Luke, describes the perilous path to Judea's confrontation with Rome. Now, you'll notice that the Olivet Discourse, it begins with the disciples admiring the beauty of the temple and Jesus telling them that not one stone will be left upon another. They then ask, when will this happen? And what follows in pretty much the rest of the discourse is a summary of social strife, religious sacrilege in the temple, deceivers and demagogues, the persecution of Christ's believers, and the devastation of Galilee and Judea. Jesus does not suddenly say, forget about the temple, let me tell you about my second coming. That there's no sense in that he suddenly changes topics. What is more, if you read Josephus' account of the Judean rebellion in his War of the Jews, which gives an account of how the rebellion began and what happened and how the Romans invaded and they sacked Jerusalem, it provides the exact backdrop to what Jesus is talking about. In fact, Luke's version, I think, is the most explicit in its details about siege warfare and the various horrors that take place. Added to that, I'd say the gathering of the elect probably refers to the escape of Jewish Christians from Jerusalem on the eve of the siege, how they fled from Jerusalem and nearby regions and went to the city of Pella, where Eusebius, a church historian, reports that they fled to. Again, the language of the Son of Man coming, the sun, the moon, and the elect being gathered, this is apocalyptic language for a socio-political catastrophe. It's talking about siege warfare, the end of the symbolic world of Second Temple Judaism with the destruction of the temple. Let me add to that two further details. Let's look at Mark 13, verses 28 to 30. These are two important details that often get neglected. You see, Jesus switches from talking about the coming of the Son of Man to telling his disciples to remember his cursing of the fig tree way back in Mark 11. Now, if we go to Mark 11, you've got there the triumphal entry, which climaxes in Jesus briefly visiting the temple. And the next day, Jesus curses the fig tree for its lack of fruitfulness, which is clearly a parable or a symbolic gesture about the temple. Jesus then engages in a prophetic action in the temple precincts, whether it's a cleansing or some kind of protest. But this tells us that Jesus' cursing of the fig tree is really about the cursing or the destiny of the temple and how it's doomed for destruction. So it's surely interesting, at the end of the Olivet Discourse, he goes back to the story of the fig tree. And that means we have a consistent pattern of Jesus portraying himself as the messianic king who stands up against the temple and its leaders. So the beginning and the end of the Olivet Discourse focuses on Jesus' critique of the temple establishment and how, unless there's some big repentance, the temple is heading towards destruction. Then, the icing on the cake is that Jesus says this generation will not pass away before these things happen. And I think that refers to this literal generation. What I find baffling is that people want to take the Son of Man's coming as literal, but they read the mention of this generation as symbolic. I think it has to be the other way around. The language of the Son of Man coming is symbolic for his enthronement, while the mention of this generation is literal. This generation, the one with Jesus, will not pass away before judgment falls upon the temple. Let me again summarize this for you with a bit of visual drama and background music.
In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus did not give his disciples a roadmap to the end times. He was not imagining a far-off meltdown of the world, but an imminent crisis within Israel, on the very steps of Jerusalem. He warned of false messiahs, false prophets, wars, famines and earthquakes, siege warfare and all its brutality. These were the birth pangs before Jerusalem's fall. He told his followers they would face persecution and suffering in their own lifetimes. The abomination that causes desolation referred to the desecration of the temple by zealots and Roman legions. When these signs appeared, Jesus urged them to flee to the mountains, a practical warning to escape the looming disaster. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened, he said. Such words only make sense if Jesus believed the events he was talking about would happen within one lifetime. The end Jesus described was the end of the second temple of Herod, not the end of the world.
Right now, I bet many of you watching this video are intrigued, a little curious, but you simply can't get your mind around the idea that the coming of the Son of Man in clouds and glory is anything other than a reference to his second coming. So Jesus must change topics. He must segue to his second coming. I think the answer to that question is yes, but only in Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse. Now, Matthew's version is a lot longer. He adds a lot more detail. He's got a lot more material about, people in the field, the faithful servant who waits for his master, the parable of the virgins, the parable of the bags of gold, and the great judgment that separates the sheep and the goats. I think Matthew has combined or conflated these two events together, the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming. Why does Matthew do that? Well, I think Matthew regards the sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple as a preview of the final judgment. So Matthew would say that the final judgment, or at least the first installment of it, began in AD 70 with the temple's destruction. And what is more, since people tend to prefer Matthew's gospel, he's everybody's favorite gospels, we tend to read Mark and Luke in light of Matthew. So I think Matthew is the odd one out here. I think he's somewhat combined or conflated the destruction of the temple with the second coming, and we tend to read Mark and Luke's version through the lens of Matthew. But Matthew has a distinctive vision of the Olivet Discourse, and he's got a lot more material he adds to pad it out and to explain it. So, in my thinking, Mark and Luke clearly have in mind the events of AD 70, whereas Matthew, clearly written later than Mark, sees the destruction of the temple as a dress rehearsal for the final judgment that takes place at Jesus' return. So that's why I think the Olivet Discourse is best understood as Jesus' prophecy against the temple, not a prediction of his second coming, even though Matthew regards the destruction of the temple as the paradigm, the pattern, or the prototype of the second coming. Again, let me give you a dramatic summary of what that means for us today.
The destruction of the temple in AD 70 by Titus's legions was more than a military defeat for Judea, it was a theological earthquake. The center of Judean life was gone, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy with chilling accuracy. This was judgment, but also a new beginning. Jesus had claimed to be the true temple. His resurrection confirmed it. God's presence now dwelled among his followers, not in stone or pillars, but in people themselves. The old order of things was passing away. A new creation had begun. Jesus was not predicting events in a distant future, nor providing a timetable for the end, but announcing God's kingdom breaking in through him. The kingdom was present, launched at his Jesus' words, signs, and mighty deeds. A claim that was vindicated when his prophecy of the temple's destruction came true. Our task is not to speculate about the end, but to live as citizens of the kingdom now. The future is God's. Our calling is faithful witness in the present.
So what have we learned, or what have I tried to convince you of in this video? Well, a few things. First, read the Olivet Discourse in light of Jesus' mission to make the prophetic hopes of Israel's restoration a reality. That means that Jesus, like the prophet Jeremiah, could speak oracles of woe against the temple. And Jesus, like the prophet Ezekiel, could look forward to a new temple. Second, the one like a son of man in Daniel 7, who received glory, dominion, power, authority, and worship, is a symbol for the triumph and the reign of the saints of the Most High over and against the pagan beasts who attack God's people. It's about vindication and enthronement, not Jesus cloud surfing his way back to earth. Accordingly, the language of the Son of Man coming in the Olivet Discourse is, I think, using prophetic and apocalyptic language to say that the temple's destruction will prove Jesus' prophecy right, and that he is indeed the Son of Man enthroned with God the Father. Third, the vast bulk of the Olivet Discourse focuses on social upheaval, religious rivalry, and the siege of Jerusalem. It's associated with the events of 66 to 70 AD, the Judean rebellion against Rome. Fourth, the fact that Jesus refers back to the cursing of the fig tree at the end of the discourse and says this generation will not pass away before these things happen, mean that he's consistently talking about the temple, not his second coming. And he means a literal generation will not pass away before these things happen. Fifth, I think Matthew conflates the destruction of Jerusalem with the second coming, or he at least sees the former as a dress rehearsal for the latter. And the problem is that Matthew is everybody's favorite gospel. So we read Mark 13 and Luke 21 in light of Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse. That's where I think a lot of our confusion comes from. So there we are. I have given you a preterist interpretation of the Olivet Discourse, arguing that Jesus' prophecy, his sermon, is all about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It was not intended to be a reference to his second coming, although it did develop that connotation in the Gospel of Matthew. So what do you think of that? Are you convinced? Are you persuaded? Do you have more questions? Or do you think this is a bunch of eschatological tomfoolery? Let me know in the comments below. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Early Christian History. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find some similar content across the channel where I deal with the historical Jesus, the New Testament, and early Christianity. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Early Christian History.